Montana Territory, July 1878, they said she was bad luck. And when the train rolled into Last Ridge under a sky the color of gunmetal, folks on the platform turned their heads, whispered, and stepped back like she carried disease. But the man leaning against the post, his hat low, boots caked in trail dust, did not move. He watched her step off that train like he had been waiting his whole life. Her name was Adeline Hale. She held a worn carpetbag in one hand and a little girl's hand in the other. The child, no older than 5, had curls the color of wheat and eyes like her mother's, green, tired, and too old for her age. "We don't want no trouble, Miss Hale," a man muttered as she passed. "You cursed that ranch back in Kansas. Drought hit a week after you arrived." Adeline said nothing. Her mouth was tight, her chin high. She only squeezed her daughter's hand and stepped down onto the dirt like she expected the earth to split beneath her. The cowboy watched the whole thing. When she turned his way, he tipped his hat. "Ma'am," she blinked, surprised someone was still speaking to her. "Hello," he looked down at the little girl. "And who might this be?" "Penny," the child said softly. "Pretty name," he said, then looked at Adeline. "You got someone meeting you?" "No," she said. He nodded once, like that settled something in his mind. "Name's Yates McAllister. I have a place about 6 miles west. You and your daughter need somewhere to go." Adeline studied him. Most men didn't ask, they accused, or stared, or made offers with hands that stayed too long. But this man just waited, quiet, solid. "I do not need charity," she said, not offering it, he replied. "I need a cook through haying season, room and board, fair pay, and my place is quiet. No one will bother you there." Adeline hesitated. She looked down at Penny, who leaned into her skirts. "We'll work," she said, "both of us." Yates nodded again. "Then let's go." They rode out together in a borrowed buckboard. Penny sat between them with a biscuit from Yates's saddlebag in her hands. The sun was low, and the wind carried the smell of wild sage and dry dirt. Adeline kept glancing sideways at him like she expected him to change his mind. "You do not know me, Mr. McAllister," she said at last. "People say I am bad luck." Yates looked straight ahead. "People say a lot of things. What do you say?" "I say I have had bad luck. That is all," he nodded. "Then we have something in common." The McAllister place was small but well kept, a pine cabin with a porch, 2 horses in the corral, chickens scratching in the dust. Adeline helped Penny down, then followed Yates inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee. There was a table, a stove, 2 chairs, and a cot in the corner. "You can take the bed," he said. "I sleep in the barn during haying anyway." "I do not need, it is not charity," he cut in gently. "Just peace." She looked around, then finally set her bag down. Penny had fallen asleep on the ride, her head on her mother's lap. Yates carried her into the cabin without a word, laid her on the bed, and covered her with a quilt. Adeline stood by the doorway, watching him. "You have children?" she asked. "No," he said, "almost once." "But she passed before he was born." Adeline's face softened. "I am sorry," he shrugged, but his eyes held the weight of it. "You hungry? I can make something. You just got here," he said. "Sit, I will cook." She did not sit, but she watched him while he stirred beans and sliced bread. When he handed her a plate, she murmured, "Thank you." They ate in silence, the kind that did not press too hard. Afterward, Yates stepped outside and Adeline followed. The stars had come out, cold and sharp in the black sky. Crickets chirped in the grass. "I should tell you," she said quietly. "Penny's father left when she was 3, said he was going for work, never came back. I was alone on a ranch I did not own. Folks blamed me for the frost that spring, then for the cattle dying. No one hired me after that." Yates looked at her. "You did not cause any of it." "Yes, well. Truth does not matter much when people are scared," he nodded. "That is true." She looked at him, her green eyes tired but still watching. "You are not like most men." He gave a low chuckle. "I never fit right anywhere. Always too quiet for saloons, too blunt for church." She smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her. "That sounds like a man I might get along with." Yates glanced at her, then looked back at the sky. "You will be safe here, Adeline. No one's going to run you off." For the first time in a long while, she believed it. She turned to head back inside, and before she went, she said softly, "Thank you, Yates." He watched her go, the soft sway of her skirts, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. Then he looked up at the stars again and whispered quietly, "They said she was bad luck, but she is the only luck I have ever had." Inside, Adeline tucked Penny under the quilt and sat beside her. Outside, Yates leaned against the porch post, listening to the night. And for the first time in years, both of them slept easy. The rooster crowed before first light, and the cabin stirred with the creak of floorboards under bare feet. Adeline moved quietly, careful not to wake Penny. She stepped out into the cool dawn, a shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, and stood watching the blue edge of morning lift over the far ridge. Yates was already in the barn. She heard the scrape of a pitchfork and the low murmur of his voice talking to the horses. She found herself listening longer than she meant to before stepping down off the porch. "You always up this early?" she asked, stepping just inside the barn's open doors. He looked over his shoulder, the sleeves of his shirt rolled to the elbow, hay stuck to his forearms. "Animals don't wait." She leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "I can help with the milking." His brow lifted just slightly, but not in protest. "You know jerseys? I know how to keep milk from scalding and how to make butter that doesn't go sour in 2 days." He nodded once and handed her the pail. "She's the gentler one," he said, motioning to the smaller cow. "Name's May." Adeline knelt beside the animal and got to work, steady and sure. Yates leaned on the rail a moment longer, watching. Then he went back to his own chores, quiet between them, but not strained. By the time the sun cut gold through the rafters, the barn was clean, the animals fed, and the pails half full. Adeline stood, brushing her skirt with a practiced hand. "You don't talk much," she said. "I talk when there's something worth saying." She smiled faintly. "That can be a rare thing." They walked back toward the house together. Penny was on the porch, rubbing her eyes and holding her rag doll by the arm. She looked at the two of them, then padded down the steps barefoot and reached for her mother's hand. Yates crouched beside her. "You like chickens?" he asked. Penny nodded cautiously. "You want to help me check for eggs?" She looked to Adeline. Her mother gave a small nod, and Penny followed him toward the coop, holding the hem of her dress in one hand like she was stepping into something sacred. Inside, Adeline set the milk to warm on the stove and began kneading dough. Her fingers moved with old memory, the rhythm of it grounding. By the time they returned, Penny had a single brown egg cradled in her palm and a shy smile tugging at her mouth. "She found it herself," Yates said, brushing dust from his knees. "Good eyes," Adeline told her daughter, and Penny beamed. Later that afternoon, while Penny napped in the shade of the porch, Adeline stood at the washbasin behind the cabin, scrubbing clothes against the board. The sound of axe on wood echoed from the trees, steady and sure. She glanced that way once, saw Yates splitting logs in a clearing, sleeves off now, sweat darkening the back of his neck. She looked away quickly and kept scrubbing. When he returned, he carried 2 armfuls of split pine and set them neatly beside the back wall. "You've been quiet today," he said. Adeline wrung out a shirt and hung it over the line. "I don't always know what to say to someone who doesn't look at me like I'm broken." Yates leaned against the post, arms folded. "You're not broken." She didn't meet his eyes. "You don't know what I've done." He didn't move. "I don't need to." Adeline picked up another shirt, thinner with wear. "I buried a child before Penny. A son. He was born early. I was alone. There was blood and it was cold and he didn't live. Folks in the next town said God was punishing me, that my sorrow was catching." Yates's voice was low. "They were wrong." She finally looked up. "Were they?" He stepped toward her slowly, careful not to crowd. "You still got up, you still kept going. That don't look like punishment to me, that looks like strength." Her breath caught just a little. "You say that like it's simple." "It's not," he said. "But it's true." The wind shifted, carrying the warm scent of pine and sun-warmed grass. Adeline turned back to the basin, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the next garment. "I don't want pity," she said. "You won't get it from me." They stood there a moment longer, the silence deepening, not heavy but honest. Then Penny stirred on the porch and Adeline turned, her voice soft again. "She'll be looking for supper soon." Yates nodded. "I'll bring in water." That night, they sat on the porch after Penny had gone to bed. The sky was wide with stars, and the lantern inside cast a soft glow through the window. Adeline wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and leaned back in the chair Yates had repaired that afternoon with a new strip of rawhide. "I used to think peace was something other people got," she said quietly. "Not women like me." Yates stared out across the dark fields. "Maybe peace isn't something we're given. Maybe it's something we build, one quiet day at a time." She looked at him, truly looked. "You believe that? I do now." And for once, she didn't doubt him. They didn't touch. They didn't speak again that night. But the quiet between them stretched long and warm, like something living had settled in the space where fear used to be. The weeks lengthened into late summer, and the fields browned under a high, dry sun. The hay was half stacked, the mornings cooler, and the rhythm of the place settled into something that wrapped around Adeline like a second skin. Penny followed Yates with quiet trust, learning the names of trees and the slow patience of barn cats. Adeline kept to the kitchen and garden, her hands always moving, her body steady, but her eyes watched more than they used to. One afternoon, with the heat curling off the earth and the wind too still to lift dust, Yates came in from the southern fence line with his shirt slung over one shoulder and a gash above his left wrist, long and shallow but bleeding freely. Adeline was at the table shelling beans. She stood the moment she saw him. "What happened?" Fence post split wrong, wire snapped back. He eased down on the bench, letting his arm rest on the table. "Ain't deep." She brought over a basin and cloth, then dipped the fabric in water and cleaned around the wound. Her touch was precise, no wasted movement, no softness either, just clean, firm care. "You should have wrapped it before it dried," she said. Her voice held no scold, just fact. "I figured you'd do it better." She paused, cloth still in her hand. "That's a lot of trust." Yates looked at her then, eyes level. "Not really." She bound the cut with a strip of linen, tugging the knot firm. "You'll scar," he shrugged. "I've got others." "Doesn't mean you need more." She cleaned the blood from the table and turned back to the beans. He stayed where he was, resting his good arm on the back of the bench, watching her work. "You always keep things this quiet?" Adeline didn't look up. "I've found silence less dangerous than talk." "Not all talk means trouble." She stopped, hands stilled in the bowl. "It did for me." For a long time, Yates didn't press. He reached for a handful of beans and helped, his movements less sure than hers but steady. "I used to think I'd marry," Adeline said after a while. "Not for love, just something solid, a man who worked the land. Someone who'd need a good cook and keep." Yates didn't answer right away. The rustle of pods filled the space between them, but "I never expected anything soft," she finished. "Didn't seem meant for women like me." He tossed a shell into the pile. "You don't think you deserve that?" "I think the world teaches some of us to aim for survival, not comfort." Yates nodded, slow and thoughtful. "Maybe. But maybe survival's only the beginning." Penny came in with her arms full of wildflowers, sunburst yellow and pale lavender, stems damp from the creek. She placed them in a chipped pitcher on the table, proud. "Miss Cora taught me what this one's called," she said, pointing to a bloom with fringed edges. "It's bee balm." Adeline brushed a hand over her daughter's curls. "It's lovely." Yates stood, wiping his hands. "I'll finish the fence before supper." "You should rest that arm." "It's my left," he said, and left it at that. That night, after Penny had fallen asleep with her doll clutched tight, Adeline stood by the window, watching the last light fade behind the ridge. Yates leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "I could teach you to shoot if you want." She turned toward him, surprised. "Why? In case you ever need to." She considered that a long moment, then nodded. "Tomorrow, then." He stepped outside and she followed. The sky was deepening to indigo, the air still holding the day's warmth. They walked without speaking, the hush of the prairie folding around them. By the barn, he handed her the rifle from the wall. She took it, feeling the weight settle into her palms. "Have you ever fired one?" "Once. Years ago." He showed her where to place her feet, how to hold steady, how not to let the recoil catch her off guard. She listened, practiced the stance without pulling the trigger. When she finally fired, the sound cracked across the field. A bird startled from the grass and rose into the dusk. Yates said nothing, just adjusted her shoulder with a gentle hand. She fired again. This time her breath stayed steady. I never thought I'd need to know this, she said. Most folks don't until they do. She lowered the gun, feeling the tremble in her arms. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. You're not what they say. She looked at him, eyes level. Neither are you. They stood there in the dark, the scent of gunpowder and hay between them. The quiet wasn't empty, it held something new now, not fear, not waiting, something that might, in time, become a place to rest. By early August, the grass had faded to the color of old parchment, and the wind carried the smell of dry earth and sun-warmed pine. The creek behind the McAllister cabin had thinned to a narrow ribbon, but it still ran cold where Penny dipped her toes and floated bits of bark like boats. Yates was in the east pasture mending the last stretch of fence before the cattle were moved. Adeline stood barefoot in the small garden, hands stained green from pulling wild mustard. She paused when she heard hoofbeats slow and deliberate. A rider approached from the south trail. She straightened, shading her eyes. It was a woman, dark-skinned and straight-backed, her hair braided in two long plaits. She rode a bay gelding and led a mule packed with sacks. When she dismounted, her boots hit the dust with quiet certainty. You the one took in Adeline Hale? She asked, her voice even. Adeline stepped forward, wiping her palms on her apron. I am Adeline Hale. The woman studied her a moment, then gave a short nod. Name's Mabel Rooker. I trade up through the Bitterroots twice a season. Yates McAllister told me to stop if I pass through. Adeline glanced toward the field. He's riding fence. Mabel tied the mule to the post and pulled down a small sack. I brought beans, flour, and a bit of dried beef. I don't take coin, only trade. Adeline motioned toward the porch. I've got preserves, rhubarb and currant. They sat in the shade, sorting goods, the air between them quiet but not strained. Penny came up the steps and leaned against her mother's knee, eyeing the stranger with the frankness only children manage. Mabel handed her a piece of candied ginger. You got your mama's eyes. Penny chewed slowly, then asked, Do you know stories? Mabel raised a brow. I know more than I ought to. That evening, Yates returned with dust on his collar and a length of frayed rope coiled over his shoulder. He greeted Mabel with a brief clasp of hands, and they spoke low in the yard while Adeline finished supper. Later, after Mabel bedded down on a pallet in the barn and Penny slept curled beneath the quilt, Adeline and Yates lingered by the hearth. The fire had burned down to a slow glow and the kettle hissed faintly. She said you told her to stop by, Adeline said. Yates nodded. Mabel's been running goods across the mountains longer than most men I know. She fought for her land after her husband died. Never bent to a soul. Adeline turned the spoon in her tea. She looked at me like she'd heard things. She has, he said quietly. She hears more than most, but she doesn't listen to gossip. Adeline glanced at him. And you? I stopped listening when I realized the loudest folks are usually the ones with the least to say. She looked down into her cup. I used to believe I had to explain myself. That if I said the right things, people would see me clearer. Yates shifted his chair closer, the scrape of it soft against the plank floor. You don't owe anyone your story. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the fire, its light painting her face in amber and shadow. I want to tell it anyway, she said at last. To someone who won't turn it into a weight. He waited, patient. I married at 17. He was older, quiet like you. I thought that meant steady, but quiet don't always mean kind. After the baby died, he stopped speaking altogether, then he left. Took our mule and the last of the seed money, never sent word. Yates's hand rested on his knee still. I stayed because I didn't know where else to go. Folks pitied me until it turned to whispers. Then I wasn't a wife anymore, I was a warning. I left before they could run me out. Yates's voice was low. You've carried that alone too long. She turned her face to him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her expression was bare, not guarded, not proud, just tired and real. I don't want to be looked at like I'm something to be pitied or feared. You're not, he said simply. You're the strongest person I've ever met. She let out a breath, unsteady but not broken. They said I was bad luck. He leaned forward, elbow braced on his thigh, voice slow and sure. They were wrong. You're the only luck I've ever had. Her eyes didn't leave his. The distance between them closed without hurry. He reached across the space with the same steadiness he used to approach a spooked horse offering, not taking. She let him take her hand. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of every hard thing they'd carried and every quiet thing they now shared. The fire crackled low and the night held still. Outside, the wind picked up just enough to lift the edge of the porch curtain. The land settled under a sky full of stars, and in the small cabin on the ridge, something steady had begun. Not loud, not sudden, but real. It was the first rain in almost 6 weeks, a slow, steady drizzle that darkened the soil and washed the dust from the leaves. Adeline stood on the porch with her shawl drawn close, watching the droplets gather on the eaves and fall in rhythmic taps against the barrels below. Penny sat cross-legged nearby, her doll wrapped in a strip of muslin, content to hum tunelessly while she traced patterns in the water that pooled around her bare feet. Inside, the warmth from the hearth softened the air, and the scent of simmering stew drifted out through the open door. Yates stepped out carrying a jar of preserved pears tucked under one arm. His boots were damp and the cuffs of his trousers held a line of mud, but his face, when he looked at her, was calm in a way that had become familiar to her now. A kind of quiet certainty that didn't ask for anything, only offered. "I found the old plow blade under the lean-to," he said. "Needs sharpening, but it'll do come spring." "I thought it was rusted through. It's solid enough, just buried under bramble," she nodded once. "Funny how things turn out stronger when you stop expecting them to be ruined." He leaned beside her, elbows resting on the rail. "You've got a way of saying things that stick." She gave a small shrug, watching the sky. "I've had a lot of time to think." Penny looked up from where she sat. "Can we plant flowers when the rain stops?" Adeline's answer came without hesitation. "Yes, we can." They ate supper by lamplight. Penny dozed before her bowl was empty, and Yates carried her to bed, tucking her in with a care that startled Adeline even now. She watched from the doorway, hands still from habit, her heart full of something she hadn't named yet. Later, after the dishes were dried and the coals banked low, Adeline sat in the chair by the hearth with her mending in her lap. Yates sat across from her, whittling a sliver of pine into a rough horse's head. "I'm thinking of building a second room onto the cabin," he said without looking up. "Come winter, it'll be close quarters otherwise." She adjusted her thread. "You expect us to stay?" He looked at her fully now. "I'd like you to." She didn't answer right away. Her needle paused halfway through a stitch. "I've never had a place where staying felt like a choice. It was always survival, not belonging. It's your choice now." Adeline set the mending aside. "And if I say yes, what then?" Yates's voice stayed steady. "Then I build the room, you plant your flowers. Penny grows up knowing she's safe, and you don't have to carry it all alone anymore." The firelight flickered low, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. She rose slowly, crossed the space between them, and stood in front of him. One hand reached out, resting lightly on his shoulder. "I want all of that," she said, "but I want it with you." He set the carving aside and stood, his hands finding hers without rush or question. "You already have me, Adeline." Then she rose up on her toes and kissed him, not out of desperation, not out of the ache of loss, but because she had found something in him she thought the world couldn't hold anymore. And he kissed her like he'd been waiting for her to believe it. The days that followed were quiet in the way that peace is quiet. Mabel returned south with half a crate of pear preserves and the promise of a room if she ever needed it. The garden took shape under Adeline's hands, rows of beans and squash and a patch of wildflowers Penny insisted on planting herself. Yates spent his mornings hauling timber and his evenings smoothing the walls of the new room with calloused palms. When the first snow came in early November, the cabin was tight and warm, the beds thick with wool blankets, the pantry full. Penny learned to read her letters by lamplight, her doll sitting beside her like a pupil. Adeline taught her to sew seams straight, and Yates carved her a set of animals from pine, each one named and lined up proudly on the mantel. They were married in the front room in late December, with Mabel as witness and Penny standing between them, holding a sprig of pine. There was no preacher, only a promise spoken plain and true, and a shared cup of cider to seal it. That night, as snow fell soft against the roof, Adeline lay in the bed they now shared, her head on Yates's shoulder, his hand resting over hers. "I don't feel like I'm surviving anymore," she whispered. His voice was sleep-warm, steady. "That's because you're not. You're home." Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying no fear, no doubt only the sound of a life beginning again, built slow and strong on the kind of love that doesn't falter when storms come. And inside, two hands stayed clasped through the dark, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Always would.